The observation deck of Valaxis Prime's primary spaceport hummed with the frequencies of interstellar commerce and bureaucratic indifference. Marcus Reeves stood motionless before the vast, transparisteel window, watching the amber sunset paint the crystalline towers of the capital city in shades of rust and gold. Behind him, the mechanical whisper of the departure gate counted down the final moments of his 3-year assignment. 17 minutes remained before the transport shuttle would disengage from the docking collar and carry him back to Earth, back to debriefing, back to the life of shadows and half-truths that he'd been trained since adolescence to inhabit. He adjusted his gray service jacket one final time, the fabric worn smooth in the places where it mattered most, the collar where his tension always concentrated, the sleeves where his fingers had worried at the seams during countless surveillance operations. His hands were steady now, though they'd trembled this morning when he'd filed his final reports with Earth Command. The data he carried in the encrypted quantum drive secured against his ribs represented 3 years of sacrifice, 3 years of lying, 3 years of watching Valaxian society from the margins while pretending to be a simple trade liaison. The Valaxians were fascinating people, he'd discovered. They moved through their lives with a kind of purposeful grace, their tall frames and iridescent skin catching the light in ways that seemed to contradict physics. They were honorable in their fashion, though their honor operated on principles entirely foreign to human understanding. They valued tradition the way humans valued oxygen, as something so fundamental that they barely acknowledged its necessity. Marcus had learned to mimic their courtesies, their formal greetings, the subtle tilting of the head that signified respect without submission. He'd learned these things well enough that some of the junior staff at the diplomatic compound had begun to forget he was human. That was always the goal. Become invisible. Become so integrated into the background of their world that you might as well be a piece of furniture, a decorative element, something that existed but never quite registered as significant enough to merit genuine attention. He'd been excellent at his job. Too excellent. Perhaps. The observation deck was nearly empty. Most travelers had already moved through the departure terminal. A few Valaxian merchants gathered in clusters, their crystal and jewelry catching the dying light. No one paid Marcus any attention. No one ever did. He was practiced enough in the art of peripheral existence that invisibility had become his second skin. The sound came first, a soft chiming that ran through the spaceport's acoustic systems, the kind of sound that meant something significant was about to occur. Then came the presence. Marcus felt it before he saw it, the way one feels the pressure change when a storm approaches, when the very air seems to reorganize itself around an approaching force. She entered through the private entrance reserved for the royal family, and every Valaxian in the observation deck performed the traditional gesture of respect without appearing to move at all, a barely perceptible inclination, a softening of posture, as if the architecture of the room itself had bowed. Marcus recognized her immediately from the intelligence briefings, though photographs had done nothing to capture the reality of her presence. Lady Seraphine was exactly as the files had described her. Tall, with the bearing of someone born to authority, her skin the deep purple blue of twilight nebulas, her hair a cascade of silver that seemed to generate its own luminescence. She wore formal robes of living silk that responded to her movements like water, shifting through gradients of indigo and violet. Her eyes, though, her eyes were what the files had failed to capture. They were the color of amethyst caught in starlight, and they held the kind of intelligence that made Marcus's carefully constructed invisibility feel suddenly fragile. She was moving through the observation deck with purpose, but there was something unusual in her trajectory. She wasn't moving toward the diplomatic terminals or the royal transport bays. She was moving toward the observation window. Toward him, Marcus's training screamed at him to move, to reposition himself into a position of less prominence, to become even more invisible. But something deeper than training held him fixed. He waited. "You're leaving," Lady Seraphine said. Her voice carried the musical quality that all Valaxians possessed, but underneath it ran something else, something with weight, with intention. It wasn't a question. Marcus turned to face her, maintaining the neutral expression that had served him so well. "My assignment has concluded, my lady." The trade liaison position was temporary. She studied him for a long moment. In the observation deck, the other Valaxians had begun to quietly excuse themselves, sensing that their presence was no longer appropriate. By the time Seraphine took a single step closer, they had all vanished, leaving them alone before the amber light of the dying sun. "I've always wondered," she said, "what it was that Earth Command actually expected you to accomplish here. Surely not simply to observe our trade practices. A species capable of interstellar travel would hardly need to spy in such a pedestrian fashion." The statement landed like a weapon precisely calibrated and deployed with surgical precision. Marcus felt his carefully constructed cover begin to fracture around him like ice under spring thaw. "I'm not entirely certain what you mean." "My lady, of course you are." She moved closer, and he caught the scent of her. Something like starlight crystallized. Something like the air after lightning has struck. "You're quite talented at your invisible observations, Mr. Marcus Reeves. I've been watching you watch us for almost as long as you've been here. I was beginning to wonder if you would leave without acknowledging the obvious." "And what would be obvious?" His voice remained steady, though inside his mind was running rapid calculations. Protocol dictated that he should attempt to leave immediately, that he should alert Earth Command to a potential security breach. But his legs refused to move. Seraphine reached out and took his hand. The contact was electric. Literally, he could feel a small charge of static between their skin, but underneath that physical sensation ran something far more dangerous. Her touch was cool, but it burned. "That I've been waiting for this moment since the first day you arrived," she said softly. "That I've committed treason in my heart every time I've resisted the urge to reveal your true nature to my council. That I've spent 3 years convinced that I was developing an obsession with a ghost." She squeezed his hand gently. "And now you're about to disappear back into the stars, and I find I cannot allow it." The departure gate chimed. 11 minutes remained. Marcus met her eyes, and in that moment, felt the careful architecture of his mission dissolve like salt in an ocean. "Then I won't go," he whispered, outside. The twin moons of Valaxis began their ascent, and in that observation deck above a city of crystalline towers, 2 people from opposite sides of the galaxy discovered that some bonds transcend all protocols, all missions, all carefully laid plans. The shuttle departed without him. The safe house existed in the shadowed district of Valaxis Prime, in a sector where the crystalline towers gave way to older architecture, structures built from stone and alloys that predated the current dynasty by centuries. Marcus had never been here before, never would have imagined such a place could exist so close to the royal quarter. Seraphine had led him through maintenance corridors and forgotten passages with the ease of someone who knew every secret architecture of her own city. They'd moved in silence, her grip never loosening from his hand, as if she feared he might evaporate into probability if she released him. The interior of the safe house was sparse, functional furniture, dark walls, communication systems that looked deliberately antiquated. There was something deeply clandestine about it, and Marcus found himself wondering how long she'd been planning this, how long she'd known about him, how long she'd been preparing for the possibility that he might actually stay. "You are going to leave," Seraphine said, finally releasing his hand as she moved to a console recessed into the far wall. The question hung between them like an accusation. "You were going to submit your reports, return to Earth, continue your life as if the past 3 years were nothing more than a successful infiltration." Marcus moved toward her slowly, carefully, as if approaching something wild that might bolt at sudden movement. That was the mission parameters. "Deep cover, 3 years minimum, extract and analyze." "I was following protocol." "Protocol." She turned to face him, and the sadness in her eyes was devastating. "Of course. Protocol doesn't account for midnight conversations on palace balconies, does it? Protocol doesn't have a category for the way you laugh when you think no one is listening, or the way you refuse the synthesized nutrients and insist on learning to cook human food in the palace kitchens. Protocol doesn't measure how I began waiting for your shadow in corridors, how I engineered situations where I might encounter you as if by accident." She pressed a control sequence, and the wall beside them illuminated with data streams, photographs, communications transcripts, surveillance logs. Marcus recognized them immediately. They were his own reports. All of them. His blood went cold. "How did you access? Earth Command sends security updates to all allied planetary governments," she interrupted, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "The reports themselves are encrypted, but the metadata is visible. Once I began looking, once I suspected what you truly were, it became relatively simple to track the pattern of your communications. You've been remarkably consistent in your transmission schedules. She pulled up another file, this one bearing the insignia of Valaxian Internal Security. I should have reported you immediately. According to our treaties with Earth, harboring an intelligence operative is grounds for diplomatic incident. My council would have demanded your immediate expulsion, possibly your detention. Why didn't you? Marcus asked, though he thought he knew the answer. He hoped he knew the answer. Seraphine moved closer until the space between them was charged with possibility and consequence. Because I'm apparently capable of committing acts of profound foolishness when someone I love is involved. The word, love, fell into the silence between them like a stone into still water, creating ripples that spread outward in all directions. Marcus reached for her, but she held up a hand, stopping him. Before you decide anything based on sentiment, she said, you need to understand the complexity of what I'm about to tell you. This safe house exists because I've been conducting a private investigation for the past 18 months. An investigation that Earth Command doesn't know about, and that my own council certainly doesn't know about. She pulled up a new file. This one contained data that made Marcus's operational training recognize the pattern immediately. Encrypted communications between unknown parties. Financial transactions routed through shell corporations. Surveillance footage of individuals in high-level positions engaging in what appeared to be covert meetings. Infiltration. Marcus breathed. Someone is infiltrating Valaxian government. Yes, Seraphine confirmed, but not in the traditional sense. At first, I thought I was dealing with simple corruption. Counselors selling classified information. Military officers accepting bribes from the Krillix Collective. That would have been simple to address. But the pattern is wrong. The cover-ups are too sophisticated. The individuals involved don't have a unified motivation or faction alignment. They're behaving as if they're responding to external command structures. Marcus moved to the console, his analytical mind already assembling the pieces. Timeline. The first anomalies began approximately 2 years ago. Minor inconsistencies that could have been dismissed as administrative error. But they've escalated. 3 months ago, I began finding evidence that someone was conducting unauthorized biological experiments in our research facilities. Specifically, experiments involving biomimetic adaptation technology. The full implication hit Marcus like a physical blow. Shapeshifters. Someone is trying to create shapeshifters. I believe so, Seraphine confirmed. But here's where it becomes complicated, and why I needed to tell you this before you made any decisions about staying. I have evidence suggesting that Earth Command might be involved. That's impossible, Marcus said immediately. But even as the words left his mouth, he was thinking about inconsistencies he'd noticed in his own briefings. Gaps in communication schedules, instructions that seemed to come from unofficial channels. Is it? Seraphine pulled up another document. I've intercepted transmissions between someone using Earth Command encryption protocols and individuals within my own government. Transmissions discussing something called Operation Convergence. Does that mean anything to you? Marcus shook his head, but his mind was racing. It's not in any briefing I received. It's not in the general database. If Earth Command is running an operation that classified, then you were never meant to know about it, Seraphine finished. Which means your presence here, your ability to observe and report on Valaxian society, might have made you a liability rather than an asset. The implication was stark and undeniable. They would extract me, or eliminate you, Seraphine said quietly. If you'd boarded that shuttle today with your final reports, I believe you would have never made it back to Earth. I think someone in command was simply waiting for your departure to ensure there were no witnesses. Marcus moved away from the console, his mind struggling to reconcile 3 years of assumed loyalty with the possibility of betrayal. Why tell me this? Why not just let me leave? Why involve yourself in something that could destroy your political standing if it became public? Seraphine's expression softened. Because I've spent enough time observing you to know that you would eventually realize the truth. And I couldn't bear the thought of you discovering it alone. Or worse, discovering it too late to make a choice that might save your life. Because whether you stay or leave, whether you choose me or choose your duty to Earth, you deserve to make that choice with complete information. She moved closer until she could reach out and touch his face. And because I've already chosen, I've chosen to believe that you're more than just a mission, more than just a tool for Earth Command to use and discard. I've chosen to believe that what we've built in stolen moments on balconies and in hidden conversations is worth the risk of everything else. Marcus caught her hand against his cheek. If you stay, she interrupted. We both become fugitives from our own governments, at least until we can prove what's happening. We'll need to trust each other completely. No secrets, no hidden protocols. Just two people trying to survive something larger than either of us. The weight of the choice settled on Marcus's shoulders like gravity. He could still leave. He could still board the next transport. Could still report this entire encounter as a compromise of his cover and have Seraphine detained. He could return to his life of shadows and carefully calibrated falsehoods, or he could step into the light with her, knowing that everything he'd built, everything he'd trained for, would be sacrificed for something he couldn't even fully name yet. He looked into her eyes, those impossible, amethyst eyes that held the stars themselves, and made his choice. Then we start gathering evidence, he said. And we stop Operation Convergence before it stops us. Seraphine smiled. And in that smile was hope, terror, and the kind of love that rewrites destinies. Outside, the twin moons climbed higher in the Valaxian sky, and two people stood together in the darkness, preparing for a war they didn't yet fully understand. The encrypted data stream flickered across the safe house's console like bioluminescent organisms darting through a midnight ocean. Marcus had been analyzing the files for 17 hours straight, running them through every decryption algorithm in his personal archive, cross-referencing timestamps with known military movements, looking for the patterns that would unravel Operation Convergence. Seraphine sat beside him, her iridescent skin now bearing the faint silver sheen that indicated exhaustion in her people. A vulnerability Marcus had never seen before their time together. There, she whispered, leaning closer to the display. That sequence. I've seen something similar in the security logs from the research facility on Cathor Station. Marcus pulled the data forward, running comparative analysis. The pattern matched immediately, a specific encryption signature repeated across 7 separate transmission chains. Each one routed through different planets, different networks, different supposedly secure channels, but the signature was consistent. Deliberate. A calling card left by someone who either didn't understand proper espionage protocol or who wanted to be found. They're not hiding well enough, Marcus said, frowning. Someone running an operation this sophisticated wouldn't leave such obvious traces unless... He stopped, the realization cascading through him like cold water. Unless they wanted us to find these traces. Unless they wanted us to follow this breadcrumb trail. Seraphine's hand tightened on his arm. A trap, or a test. Marcus pulled back from the console, his tactical mind already running scenarios. If someone in Earth Command knows that I didn't board that shuttle, if they suspect I'm working with you, then providing false leads would be a way to flush us out. To see if we'd pursue it, to identify exactly where we are and who we're communicating with. Before Seraphine could respond, the safe house's secondary communications array chimed, a soft, almost apologetic sound that made Marcus's entire body go rigid. Seraphine moved immediately to check the incoming transmission, her fingers flying over the controls with the competence of someone who'd been trained in more than just administrative protocols. Her face went pale beneath its purple hue. What is it? Marcus was already moving toward her, every survival instinct screaming that something catastrophic had just occurred. My brother, Seraphine whispered. My younger brother Kyle. He sent an emergency signal from his research post on Thessaly 7. The transmission is heavily corrupted, but the core message is clear. She turned to face Marcus, and her eyes held an emotion so raw it transcended any biological difference between their species. He says there's been a break-in at the facility. Someone has stolen the biomimetic prototype database, and she couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Marcus was already reading the continuation of the message on the console. 3 of the research staff have been murdered, he read aloud. Their bodies were found in a state of biological degradation inconsistent with any known Valaxian pathology. Marcus met her eyes. They were being converted, the implications unfurled like a blooming flower of horror. The theoretical shapeshifters Seraphine had suspected were more than theoretical. They were real. They were operational. And someone had just stolen the technical specifications needed to manufacture them on a mass scale. We need to go to Thessaly 7, Seraphine said immediately, moving toward the communication console to begin plotting a trajectory. We need to secure Kale and We can't, Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the cold precision of operational necessity. If we travel directly to Thessaly 7, we're walking directly into wherever this operation is centered. We're playing into their hands. Then what do you suggest? Seraphine's voice carried a note of desperation that made Marcus's heart constrict. That we abandon my brother to whatever is happening there? No, Marcus said, moving to stand beside her. But we need to understand the full scope of the threat first. We need to know not just what's been stolen, but who's stealing it and how they're distributing it. He pulled up another data stream, this one from his own personal intelligence archive. Information he'd never reported to Earth Command because it had seemed irrelevant to his primary mission. Scattered reports of unusual military movements in the outer colonies, unexplained personnel transfers, ships moving through supposedly secure space without proper authorization, individual pieces of intelligence that seemed insignificant in isolation but which, when assembled together, created a pattern of systematic infiltration across multiple planetary governments. It's not just Valaxis, Marcus said quietly. It's not even just Earth Command. Something larger is happening. Multiple governments are being compromised simultaneously. Multiple research facilities are either being raided or are voluntarily selling access to restricted technology. Seraphine's expression hardened into something ancient and dangerous. A coup, on a galactic scale. The safe house's primary alarm suddenly shrieked to life, a wailing sound that seemed to vibrate through Marcus's bones. Emergency klaxons echoed through the corridors outside, the sound that meant security systems had been triggered. The safe house's defensive measures activated automatically, metal shutters descending over the windows, communication arrays going dark. We've been located, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He moved to the weapons cache that Seraphine had shown him on their first night in the safe house. A collection of pulse rifles and energy blades, tools of violence that he'd hoped they wouldn't need to use. The back exit, Seraphine said, already moving toward a panel in the far wall. There's a passage that leads into the old city's undercroft. We can reach the secondary transport depot. They'd barely made it 3 meters when the front wall of the safe house erupted inward in a shower of crystallized polymer and acrid smoke. Through the breach came figures, humanoid, but moving with a synchronization that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Their skin seemed to shimmer, as if unable to fully commit to any single form. Their eyes were empty, not blank but actively vacant, as if something essential had been removed and replaced with pure, cold-function mimics. The theoretical threat had become physical reality. Marcus fired without hesitation, the pulse rifle bucking against his shoulder as he drove a concentrated beam of coherent energy into the lead figure. The mimic collapsed, its form dissolving into a gelatinous substance that smelled of ozone and organic decay, but 2 more emerged from the smoke behind it. "Go!" he shouted to Seraphine, laying down suppressive fire while she sprinted toward the rear exit. The mimics moved with predictable efficiency, their attacks following mathematical precision. But Marcus had spent 3 years studying Valaxian combat tactics, 3 years learning to move like his hosts while retaining the unpredictable improvisation that came naturally to humans. He used furniture as cover. He fired through doorways. He ducked under attacks that were calibrated for Valaxian height and physiology. Seraphine activated the emergency exit panel, and a section of the wall spiraled open, revealing a passage carved from ancient stone. She reached back, grabbed Marcus's arm, and pulled him through just as another volley of energy fire scorched the space where he'd been standing. The passage descended steeply into darkness. Their breath came in ragged gasps as they ran, Marcus's human physiology screaming in protest, while Seraphine's longer legs carried her forward with graceful efficiency. Behind them, they could hear the pursuing footsteps of the mimics. Not the sound of biological runners, but the mechanical precision of something that didn't need to breathe, didn't need to tire. There, Seraphine pointed ahead, where a transport vessel sat waiting in an underground docking bay, sleek, small, bearing the insignia of civilian traders. Seraphine had clearly prepared for more contingencies than she'd initially revealed. She'd prepared for war. They threw themselves into the cockpit just as the pursuing mimics emerged from the tunnel. Seraphine fired the ignition sequence, and the vessel lifted vertically with gut-wrenching acceleration. Behind them, energy fire erupted from the docking bay, but they were already moving too quickly to be caught. "Kyle," Seraphine whispered, her hands white-knuckled on the controls. "If they've reached him, they haven't," Marcus said with more confidence than he felt. "Not yet, because if they had, they wouldn't have revealed themselves to us. They need us alive. They need us to lead them somewhere." He pulled up the vessel's systems, running diagnostics on the communications array. "Can you reach Kale on a secure channel?" "I can try," Seraphine replied. She began inputting a sequence of codes, her movements precise despite the fear shadowing her face. The communication crackled to life, and a young Valaxian's voice emerged, rapid, panicked, speaking in a dialect of the Valaxian language that Marcus had only heard in old historical archives. Seraphine's response was immediate and fierce. Even without understanding the exact words, Marcus could translate the emotional content: determination, fear, love, and a promise that sounded very much like a vow to move mountains if necessary. When she ended the transmission, her eyes met Marcus's. "He's alive. He's hidden in the research facility's emergency vault." "But Marcus," he said, "the mimics are already inside the perimeter." "He said there are dozens of them, and he said something else." She paused, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "He said one of